November 1943. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare earth. Inside, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic in cramped holds, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. Most had fought in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Afrika Korps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. They were young men, mostly, their faces hollowed by defeat, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. The camp itself was efficient, orderly, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows. There were kitchens, latrines, a small infirmary. The guards were professional, neither cruel nor kind, simply present. Yet despite the relative comfort, despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the camp felt suffocating. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. It was the silence. In the evenings, when work details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery, the men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, staring at walls. Conversations were brief, tense, filled with suspicion. Political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts hidden, knowing that even here, thousands of miles from the Reich, informants watched and reported. Violence became routine. Fights erupted over perceived insults, over bread rations, over nothing at all. Men needed targets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. The camp commandant, a colonel named William Marsh, documented these incidents with growing concern. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with injuries from brawls. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines, his assailants never identified. The guards increased patrols. They imposed stricter curfews. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. Nothing worked. The camp was a pressure cooker, and the only question was when it would explode. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, something unexpected arrived. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. Inside were musical instruments. Violins, cellos, a trumpet, several clarinets, an accordion, even a battered upright piano. They had been requisitioned from military surplus, donated by churches, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. Others spat in disgust. Music, they said, was for victors. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Not for the defeated. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. November 1943. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, and 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Winced at the dissonance. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, passing by the recreation hall glanced through the windows with expressions ranging from curiosity to across bare earth. A few muttered insults. 3,000 German prisoners shouted that he was wasting his time. But Klaus arrived in waves throughout the autumn, hours shipped across the Atlantic in cramped holds, his fingers bled and transported by rail through a country his back ached from sitting hunched over the instrument. Most had fought in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia for the first time since his capture. Finally, he was not thinking about the Allied superiority. He was not replaying others the battles, came from Sicily, not mourning the dead, the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. He might spend in this place. They were young men, mostly. He was simply playing music, hollowed by and the music demanded their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely gathered outside the crumble. The camp itself was efficient, orderly, they stood at a distance, according to Geneva Convention standards, listening without admitting they were listening seriously. Among them was a man named Otto Becker, a sergeant who had earned a reputation for brutality in the camp, a small infirmary. He had been one of the ringleaders in several of the fights, neither cruel, a true believer in National Socialism who openly threatened anyone he considered the relative traitors. Despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the camp felt suffocating. Then he turned and walked away without a word. It was not the wire that imprisoned him most. The next day, another prisoner approached Klaus. His name was Ernst Fischer, a violinist from farms who had played in a small orchestra before the war. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, if he could staring at walls. Klaus nodded. Conversations were brief. They spent the afternoon trying to find harmonies, struggling political divisions that had simmered in the language boiled over in captivity. Hardline Nazis accused others of gathering in the recreation hall. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler, a trumpet player from Hamburg, knowing that even here, thousands of studied under a renowned teacher in Berlin watched and reported. An accordion player violins performed in beer halls and cabarets. Fights erupted over perceived insults, from different backgrounds, over bread rations, different ranks, over nothing at all. Political beliefs. Men needed targets in any other circumstance, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. With instruments in their hands, the camp commandant, they focused on something more immediate than ideology, documented these incidents with growing concern. They focused on creating sound. In 1 week alone, the transformation was not sudden. Hospitalized with injuries from brawls. It crept in slowly, note by note. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines, alone, his assailant absorbed in his own practice. The guards increased patrols. They began to play together. They imposed stricter curfews. Someone suggested a folk song everyone the most knew. Aggressive prisoners. The harmony was rough, nothing worked, the timing imperfect. The camp was a pressure cooker, and the only question was when it would explode. Surprise. Then, on a cold afternoon in late November, the other prisoners began to take notice. A truck pulled up to the main gate, them, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked with fraternizing with the enemy's culture. Inside others lingered near the recreation hall in the evenings, violins drawn by the sound, a trumpet, several music had a strange effect in the camp, even a battered upright piano. It softened the air. They had been requisitioned for military surplus, cages, donated by churches. Men who had been on the verge of violence found themselves for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, forgetting for a moment why they had been so angry. One commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. He announced they would attempt the reaction was immediate and hostile. Several prisoners laughed bitterly, perhaps foolishly so. Others spat in disgust. They did not have a full-string music, but they would adapt. Was for victors. Ernst on violin. It was for men who had something to celebrate. Clarinetist improvising where the second violin should have been. Not for those rotting behind player would sit this one out. But in the back of one they rehearsed for a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin over interpretations, starting over again and again. A former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. Nearly 200 prisoners came. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. On the floor, leaning against walls. The war had stolen that from him. Some had their arms crossed defensively. That night, others stared at the ground. Argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge. Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. The opening notes fragile about the cello concerto he had been learning. But as the piece notice arrived, something shifted in the room. About the way music had once made him feel that had defined the camp for months began to dissolve. He walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. There was silence. The guards watched him with the silence of before. He picked up the cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then, slowly, he began to clap. Others joined. The applause was not loud or enthusiastic. It was quiet, almost reluctant, as though they were afraid to admit what the music had made them feel. Otto Becker sat in the back row. He did not clap. But he also did not leave. November 1943, more prisoners joined the makeshift ensemble, 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about how to keep rhythm. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. Another prisoner, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and broken guitars that had cast long shadows across bare earth. The group began calling themselves 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. The prisoners Philharmonic. They had arrived in waves. It was meant as a joke, shipped across the Atlantic in circumstances, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. They performed twice a week now. Most had fought in North Africa, surrendering at Tunisia when their evenings plotting escape or nursing grudges the weight of Allied superiority. The camp commandant noticed a change from the beaches where the invasion of Europe incidents dropped. They were young men,
retreated,
fewer injuries, their faces hollowed by defeat.
Guards
reported that tension seemed to be eased after believing in something quite explain why, and then watching it crumble. But not everyone welcomed the transformation. Efficient, orderly. The hardliners saw the Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. It represented surrender, wooden barracks stood in captivity rather than resist it. There were kitchens, latrines, and his faction began to exert pressure on the musicians. The guards were professional, neither they whispered that Klaus and the others were collaborators, that they had grown soft, despite the relative they had forgotten their duty to the fatherland that was adequate and the medical care that was available. After a particularly well-attended performance, Ernst found it was not the wire that imprisoned them most. His violin was gone. It was the silence. He searched frantically, in the evenings, asked everyone details returned but from no one admitted they had picked cotton or repaired machinery. Klaus knew what the men retreated into their barracks and the hardliners had taken it, staring likely at walls. Destroyed it. Conversations were devastated, brief, tense, filled without with the violin. He felt purposeless political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in Otto the next day. Hardline Nazis faced each other of cowardice, surrounded by prisoners. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts demanded the return of the violin. Thousands of miles from the right, coldly and said he knew nothing about it. But his eyes became otherwise. Fights erupted over perceived insults, over the brief peace that music had created was fragile, and the forces of anger and resentment were pushing back. And when the enemy was out of reach, Klaus realized that if they wanted the music to survive, the camp commandant, to do more than simply play. William Marsh, documented these incidents with growing concern. He went to the commandant with a proposal. 3 men were hospitalized for permission to hold a concert, not just for another was found beaten for the guards behind the latrines. His assailants never civilians from the nearby town. The guards increased patrols. He argued that music could be a bridge. They imposed a way to remind everyone involved that they were human beings. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. Commandant Marsh was skeptical. The camp was worried about security, and the only question was when Germans entertaining Americans while the war raged. On a cold afternoon in late November, he also saw the decline in unexpected violence, saw how the music had changed the camp's pulled up to the main gate, and guards after days of deliberation marked with official military stamps, but with conditions. Inside were musical instruments. The concert would be heavily supervised. Violins, cellos. If anything went wrong, the music program would end permanently. Even a battered upright piano. The announcement sparked fierce debate. They had been requisitioned from military surplus. Some saw it as an opportunity collected from communities. Others saw it as humiliation. For reasons the prisoners could not fathom, animals that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. Otto Becker called a meeting in the barracks announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. He said anyone who participated was a traitor. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Klaus knew that the concert would either unite the camp or destroy the fragile harmony they had built. Others spat in disgust. He also knew that Otto would not let it proceed without interference. It was the question was whether the music was strong enough to withstand the pressure. Not for the defeated. In the days leading up to the concert, the musicians rehearsed, but in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin classical masterworks to German. He was 24 years old, a former music student on including something American as well, a gesture that outraged the hardliners, but which he believed was necessary. He had not touched an instrument. They settled on Shenandoah, a melody that was stolen that from him, something that had stolen everything else in any language. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about finding a note slipped Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. It was unsigned, but the message was clear. Concerto if you perform tomorrow when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. December 1943. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, recreation hall 40 miles from the nearest town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. A makeshift stage had been constructed from rolling hills and sparse pine forests. The piano had been tuned by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across the temperature had dropped below freezing. Inside, and frost 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a war to end. By 6 o'clock, they had arrived in waves throughout the autumn. Prisoners filled the first in cramped holds, their faces a mixture of anticipation and they had been taught to despise. Otto Becker sat near the back, in North surrounded by his loyalists, surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa Corps finally collapsed under the weight of Allied along the walls, rifles at rest. Others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. Civilians began entering. They were young men, mostly local families, faces invited by the commandant, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching unsure why they had been asked to attend. The camp itself was official like enemy soldiers, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. Ernst was beside him, holding a replacement violin that had been found in storage. There were kitchens, latrines, the other musicians tuned their instruments, adjusting strings, testing notes, neither cruel nor kind. The threat from the previous night lingered in Klaus's mind. Yet despite the relative comfort, himself to focus, despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the camp Commandant Marsh stepped onto the stage and addressed the crowd. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. He spoke briefly about the importance of humanity even in wartime. In the evening, about the Geneva Convention, returned from about farms where the men could be enemies on the battlefield, but the men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks. His words were met with polite silence from the civilians and stony faces from many of the prisoners, filled with suspicion. Then the music political began. Divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over on the G-string, a piece so delicate and mournful that it seemed to still the air itself. Those who had Klaus played the cello with his eyes closed, thoughts hidden, pouring every ounce of emotion into the thousands of miles from the Reich. The violins wove around him, reported. The clarinet added violence became routine, and the accordion provided a subtle erupted over perceived insults. The audience sat motionless, over nothing at all. When the piece ended, there was a target for their rage, before the applause and when the enemy was out of reach, it was hesitant at first, unsure. But the camp commandant, a colonel named looked out at the crowd and documented these incidents with growing concern. Tears on the face of a guard. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized clutching her husband's hands. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines, momentarily his assailants never identified. They continued with a Mozart increased patrols, then a Schubert Lied adapted for their ensemble. They imposed stricter curfews. Each piece seemed to chip away at the most aggressive captors and captives, between Germans and Americans. The camp was a pressure cooker. Klaus realized the only question was not about forgetting the war. Then, it was about remembering what the war had tried to destroy. Something unexpected arrived. Then came the moment Klaus had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Unloaded wooden crates marked with official and announced they would now play Shenandoah. Inside were musical instruments. There was an audible murmur from the German prisoners, cellos, a trumpet, Otto Becker several clarinets, his chair scraping loudly against the upright piano. He shouted something in German from military Klaus a traitor, donating this was an insult to the fatherland. From communities that believed several of his followers joined in, not fathom their voices that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. Klaus stood at the center of the stage. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. He looked at Otto and said, quietly, the reaction was immediate. Music belongs to everyone. Several prisoners laughed German or American. Others spat in disgust. The hall erupted in argument was for victors. Some prisoners shouted their agreement with something to celebrate. Others told him to sit down. Not for the defeated. The guards not for those rotting hands moving toward their weapons. But in the back of one barracks, Marsh stood, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, the opening a former music student from Leipzig, pure and clear and into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before one by one the other musicians joined him. He had not touched an instrument. Klaus lifted his cello and added the deep, the war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. Life into the melody. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Otto stood frozen on his bunk, his rage colliding with something he could not name. About the cello concerto, the melody wrapped around when the draft note everyone in the hall, and for 3 minutes about the way music had once made him feel there was no war. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept, and the sound was human. The guards watched him when the final note faded. The silence was absolute. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, from the front row, felt the weight of it against his chest, and began to clap. Then he began to play. Others joined. The applause spread through the hall, hesitant at first but growing steadier. Even some of the prisoners who had been shouting moments before found themselves clapping, their hands moving almost against their will. Otto did not clap. But he sat down. The concert continued for another hour. They played folk songs, both German and American. They played a piece composed by one of the prisoners, a haunting melody about being far from home. And they ended with Beethoven's Ode to Joy, the anthem of brotherhood that had once promised a united Europe before hatred tore it apart. When it was over, the prisoners filed out quietly. The civilians thanked Commandant Marsh, several saying they had never expected to feel such emotion from enemy soldiers. The guards relaxed, surprised that the evening had ended without incident. Klaus and the other musicians stood on the stage, exhausted but exhilarated. They had done it. They had proven that music could transcend even this. But as Klaus packed away his cello, he saw Otto standing in the doorway, watching him. Their eyes met for a long moment. Then Otto turned and disappeared into the night. November after the concert felt different. Somewhere in rural Tennessee, still had barbed wire, 40 miles still from the nearest town, and curfews, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. But something had shifted. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and had avoided each other now nodded in passing. Enclosed by double fences of barbed wire in the mess hall were less cast long shadows across even the hardliners seemed subdued. Inside, as though the music had drained some prisoners of war waited for a war to end. Otto Becker did not attend the next concert. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, or the one after that, across the Atlantic in cramped stopped openly then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. His followers still muttered about betrayal, most had words carried less weight, surrendering at Tunisia when created a space where finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Then, Then, 3 weeks after the concert, from Sicily, something from unexpected where the invasion of Europe had begun. Klaus was practicing alone in the recreation hall, mostly, working through a particularly difficult passage, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely, Otto standing in the doorway. For a moment itself was neither man spoke. Orderly, built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. But Otto did not look angry. Stood in neat rows. He looked lost. There were kitchens, I played piano, Otto said finally. His voice was rough, as though the words were difficult to shape, simply present. Before the war. Yet despite the relative comfort, I was not very good, despite the food that was adequate and the medical care that was available, the camp I have not thought about it in years. It was not the wire that imprisoned the most. Music was silence. It was something from before. In the evenings, when work from details a person returned not from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery, the men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, silent for staring at walls. Then conversations were brief, you played tense, filled with suspicion. I wanted to hate you. Political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. But I could not. Hardline Nazis accused others of cowardice. Klaus understood. Those who had grown disillusioned with music had a way of bypassing the armor men built around themselves. Thousands of miles from the right, it reached something deeper than ideology, deeper than anger. Violence became routine. It touched the places that war had not yet destroyed. Insults, over bread rations, play, over nothing at all. Klaus asked. Men needed targets for their rage, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. They went to the camp commandant, a colonel named William Marsh, placed his hands on these incidents with growing concern. His fingers were stiff. In 1 week alone, uncertain. 3 men were hospitalized with simple melody from brawls, childlike in its innocence. Another was found beaten unconscious. Klaus recognized it as a lullaby. His assailants never might sing to her child. The guards increased patrols. Hands trembled as he played, and when he finished, stricter curfews. He sat motionless, staring. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. I have done terrible things. Nothing Otto said quietly. The camp was a pressure cooker, and the only question was when it would explode. I thought I had to be hard. On a cold afternoon I thought anything else was weakness. Something unexpected arrived. Klaus did not respond immediately. A truck pulled up to the main gate. What could he say? Guards unloaded wooden crates. Forgiveness was not military stamps. Judgment was not his to pass. Musical instruments. But music, violins, was available to everyone. Several clarinets, even to men who had done terrible things. Even a battered upright piano. You can keep playing. They had been requisitioned from military surplus. If you want, donated by churches, Otto nodded. Collected from communities that he stood and left without another. Prisoners could not fathom. But the next enemy soldiers he returned beauty. And the commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. He began to reintegrate himself into the life of the camp. Hostile. He did not join the prisoners. Laughed bitterly. Not yet. Others spat in disgust. But he stopped reading the hardliners. Was for victors. He stopped threatening the musicians. It was for men who had something to celebrate. He simply played the piano, not for the defeated, working through the lullabies of those rotting behind of his childhood. But in the back of one barracks, was not complete. A man named Klaus Zimmermann Otto still carried the weight of what he had on the bulletin board. But the music gave him a path back to something resembling humanity. A student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa. If Otto Beck could finish the most feared man in the camp, he had not touched an instrument in 3 years. Men who had been nursing grudges found themselves letting go everything else. The violence that had once defined the camp while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge. Klaus lay on his musicians thought about Brahms, then 15. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft noted not just prisoners but guards and civilians. About the way music had once made him feel human. The recreation hall became a place of pilgrimage, to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. Klaus marveled at what had happened. Indifference. He had picked up a cello because he ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. He had not imagined it would change lives. Then he began to play. But music, he realized, was not passive. It was a force. It demanded attention, required vulnerability, insisted on connection. And in a place designed to separate enemies, connection was revolutionary. One evening, after a performance of Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons, an American guard approached Klaus. He was young, barely 20, with a face that had not yet hardened into the mask that war required. "My father plays cello," the guard said. "Back in Ohio. He would have loved this." Klaus smiled. "Perhaps when the war ends, he can come play with us." The guard laughed, but there was sadness in it. "When the war ends," he repeated, as though the phrase were a prayer. Klaus understood. The war had gone on so long that peace felt like a fantasy. But here, in this camp, in this hall, they had created a kind of peace. It was small and fragile and temporary. But it was real. November arrived in Tennessee with a gentleness that seemed almost cruel. Rural Tennessee, 40 miles from the nearest wildflowers town, a place existed that most Americans never knew about. Prisoners were allowed to work outside. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. The first letters closed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that Klaus received a letter from his mother in Leipzig. Inside, she wrote about the 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for war neighbors who had disappeared. They had arrived, but she also wrote about music shipped across the Atlantic. She told him that despite everything, then transported by rail from the countries they had been taught to despise. The concerts were short in North Africa, and the hall was surrendering half Tunisia when the musicians' corpse finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Even in darkness, there must be sound. Others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had begun. His mother were young men, mostly, their faces hollowed by defeat, their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching about teaching their children to sing. The camp itself was efficient. Fathers described listening to scratchy recordings on Geneva Convention standards that the United States took seriously. Brothers mentioned joining amateur choirs. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows. It seemed, was surviving the war. Latrines, not just surviving, but resisting. The guards were professional. In every note played, every song sung, simply people were asserting that they were still human. Yet despite the relative comfort, Klaus shared his mother's letter with the ensemble during a rehearsal that was available. The camp read it aloud, his voice catching on certain phrases. It was not the wire that imprisoned them most. When he finished, it was the silence. In the evening, then someone suggested they dedicate their next concert to everyone back home who was still making music. The men retreated into their barracks and the concert became a celebration of resilience. Conversations were German folk songs, tense, pieces that spoke to longing and hope and the endurance of divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht. They also now boiled over in other countries, Russian melodies, hardline Nazis accused others of Italian arias. Those who had grown disillusioned with music did not belong to nations, knowing that even here, it belonged to miles from the Reich. The audience that night included a journalist from Nashville who had been granted permission to attend. Fights erupted over perceived insults. He wrote about the concert in his newspaper, bread ration, describing the strange scene of German prisoners playing with such passion, targets for their rage, by American and when the enemy was out of reach, tears in their eyes, they turned on each other. The article was picked up by other papers. A colonel named Camp Crossville documented these just another POW facility. In 1 week alone, a story about 3 men were hospitalized with injuries. Not everyone appreciated the attention. Another was found beaten. Some Americans were outraged that enemy soldiers were being treated so well, that they were being given instruments and audiences while American boys died in Europe. They imposed stricter curfews. There were calls to shut down the most aggressive prisoners, to return the camp to its intended purpose as a place of confinement. The camp was a pressure cooker, but commandant and the only question was when it would explode. He wrote reports documenting the decrease in late November, the improvement in unexpected arrival, the psychological benefits of cultural engagement. A truck pulled up to the main gate, and guards unloaded the Geneva Convention required military stamps, and that music was inside part of that were musical instruments. The debate violins, in newspapers and town halls, a trumpet, several clarinets. Some people drove to the camp to protest. Even a battered upright piano. Others came to support. They had been requisitioned from the military watched this conflict donated behind the wire, collected from communities that believed, for reasons the prisoners could not fathom, that enemy soldiers deserved. They had simply wanted to play music. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. If anything, the reaction was immediate made them more important. Several prisoners left became an act of defiance against those who believed that enemies could not be human. Music, they said, was for victors. Public opinion began to shift. It was for men who had something to celebrate. More civilians attended the concerts. Not for the defeated. Teachers brought their students. Not for those rotting behind wires. Churches organized trips. But in the back of one barracks, people came expecting to see Klaus Zimmermann and instead found young men who missed their bulletin board, who played Beethoven with the same reverence Americans had for their own composers from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. Wrote a letter to the Nashville newspaper. He had not touched an instrument attending a concert and watching a German prisoner play a lullaby on the accordion, as it had stolen everything else. She recognized the melody as one she sang to her others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge. She realized that the men behind the wire were not so different from her husband. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. They were all someone's son. About the way music had once made him feel, and they all needed music to remember what they were fighting. He walked to the recreation hall where the letter was reprinted across Tennessee. The guards watched him with indifference. More conversation, more visits. He picked up a cello. More people ran his fingers along the strings. Human beings felt the weight of it against his chest. Klaus read the letter and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. Not hope that the war would end tomorrow, or that he would be released soon. But hope that something good could survive even this. That music had proven stronger than hatred. November 1943, even the fragile peace music had created, somewhere in rural Tennessee, vulnerable, 40 miles from the nearest town, 1944, a place existed that most Americans about the Allied invasion of Normandy. Camp Crossville sat between rolling hills and sparse pine forests, listening to reports of massive double fences of barbed wire and British forces pushing long shadows across bare earth. For some, it was devastating. 3,000 German prisoners they had believed was clearly lost. They had arrived in waves throughout the both sides, shipped and there would be no miracle cramped holds, then transported by rail through particularly the hardliners to despise. The news sparked renewed rage. Most had fought in North Africa. They blamed surrendering at Tunisia when Rommel's Africa the cowardly finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Had not fought hard enough. Others came from Sicily, the prisoners from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had allowed themselves to become soft. They were young men, mostly their faces had been slowly integrating their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely and then watching it crumble. Former comrades confronted him, accused him of forgetting his due Geneva Convention standards. They demanded the United States took seriously. He was still loyal to the cause. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows. The pressure built for weeks. There were kitchens, small incidents occurred, a small infirmary, notes, instruments damaged. The guards were professional, musicians confronted in the yard, nor kind, simply Klaus tried to maintain calm. Yet despite the relative tension rising, despite the food that was on the edge of exploding was available, the camp felt suffocating. On a sweltering afternoon it was not the wire that imprisoned them most. The ensemble was rehearsing in the recreation hall when Otto entered when work details returned from farms where they looked agitated, repaired machinery. The men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, ready to defend the instruments if necessary. Conversations were brief. This ends today, one of the hardliners said. Political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht no more performances for the enemy. We are soldiers, Nazis not others of cowardice. We are prisoners. Those who had grown disillusioned with Hitler kept their thoughts and we are choosing how to survive captivity thousands of miles from the Reich by betraying everything watched and reported. By remembering why we are human. Fights the confrontation escalated. Insults, over bread voices rose, over nothing at all. Fists clenched. Men needed targets for the other musicians stood, and when the enemy was out of reach, they turned on each other. The guards outside heard the commotion named William Marsh documented these incidents stood at the growing concern. Torn between two worlds. In 1 week alone, 3 men were hospitalized with ideology and violence, and the new self was found had begun unconscious behind the latrines. He looked at Klaus, never identified his former comrades. The guards increased patrols. He walked to the piano. Stricter curfews. He sat down. They isolated the most aggressive prisoners. The hardliners froze, confused. The camp was a pressure cooker. Otto played the lullaby. The only question was when it would explode. Melody he had been practicing for months. On a cold afternoon his fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence, and the music filled the hall to the main gate that made guards unloaded wooden crates marked with official military stamps. The other musicians joined him. Inside were musical instruments. Ernst picked up his violins, cellos, returned to his cello, several clarinets. The clarinetist added a gentle battered upright piano. The accordion had been requisitioned from military surplus. The hardliners stood motionless, their rage disarmed by sound. For reasons the prisoners could not for a fight, that enemy soldiers deserved beauty. You can only listen or leave. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. But a few stayed. The reaction was immediate and when the music ended, they did not Several prisoners laughed bitterly. They simply nodded and walked away, spat in leaving the instruments untouched. Music, they said, it was the closest the camp came to violence after the music began. It was for men who had something to celebrate. And it was music that stopped it. Not for the defeated. Not for those rotting behind wire. But in the back of one barracks, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement posted on the bulletin board. He was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent to Africa before he could finish his studies. He had not touched an instrument in 3 years. The war had stolen that from him, as it had stolen everything else. That night, while others argued about escape plans and fantasized about revenge, Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about Brahms. About the cello concerto he had been learning when the draft notice arrived. About the way music had once made him feel human. The next morning, he walked to the recreation hall where the instruments were kept. The guards watched him with indifference. He picked up a cello, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his chest. Then he began to play. November 1945. Somewhere in rural Germany Tennessee, surrendered, 40 miles from the nearest Camp Crossville learned they would not be going most Americans never knew about. Repatriation would take time, months between rolling hills and sparse pine forests. They would have to wait, enclosed by double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers that cast long shadows across bare earth. More vibrant than ever. Inside, 3,000 German prisoners of war waited for a new quality, not of escape or resistance. They had arrived in waves throughout the autumn, shipped across the Atlantic not to forget the war, then transported by rail through a country they had been taught to despise. Klaus received another letter from his mother. Most had fought in North Africa. Leipzig had been bombed heavily in the final months, and their home was finally collapsed under the weight of Allied superiority. Living with relatives. Others came from Sicily, from the beaches where the invasion of Europe had still playing. They were young men, back, mostly, every day, their faces hollowed by defeat. It is the only thing their eyes carrying the emptiness that comes after believing in something absolutely, and then watching the Red Cross arranged for a special concert. The camp itself was efficient, orderly, for the prisoners built according to Geneva Convention standards that the United States everyone who had ever attended. Guards and civilians stood in neat rows. Even some former hardliners who had quietly come to appreciate what the music represented. Infirmary. The guards were professional, neither cruel nor kind, people standing along the walls, others peering through the relative comfort. Despite the ensemble had expanded to 20 musicians available, a full orchestra by prison camp standards. It was not the wire that performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, it was the silence, the peace that celebrated brotherhood and unity. When work details returned from farms where they had picked cotton or repaired machinery, looked out at the audience, the men retreated into their barracks and sat on their bunks, Germans and Americans, former enemies, conversations were brief, tense, the words were in German, but the meaning transcended political divisions that had simmered in the Wehrmacht now boiled over in captivity. The chorus proclaimed, and in that moment, Nazis accused others of cowardice. It was true. Those who music and disillusion, the applause lasted for 10 minutes, knowing that even people wept thousands of miles from the Reich. Guards and informants watched and reported. Civilians thanked musicians for reminding them what humanity looked like. Fights erupted over perceived insults. Klaus packed away his cello that night over nothing would likely never see most of these men needed targets for their rage. They would scatter across the devastated Europe. They turned on each other. Homes that might not exist. The camp tried to rebuild lives from rubble. William Marsh, but they would carry these incidents with growing concern. Otto Becker in 1 week alone, before leaving, 3 men were hospitalized. He held out his injuries from brawls. Klaus shook it. Another was found beaten unconscious behind the latrines. They had both been saved by the same thing. The Camp Crossville closed in 1946. They imposed stricter curfews. The barracks were dismantled. The fences torn down. The most aggressive watchtowers removed. Nothing worked. The land returned to Tennessee farmers. The camp was a pressure cooker, within a few years, and the only question was trace of the camp remained. Then, but the music cold afternoon in late November, Klaus returned to Leipzig and joined the rebuilt Gewandhaus Orchestra to the main gate, and guards unloaded wooden crates marked always remembering the prison camp where music had stopped. Inside were musical instruments. Ernst moved to Munich and taught violin at a conservatory, trumpet, passing on not just technique and accordion, lesson he had learned battered upright piano. That music could heal even the deepest wounds. They had been requisitioned from military surplus. Otto Becker never played piano professionally. Collected from communities that he became a schoolteacher in a small town in Bavaria, and he taught his soldiers about more than mathematics and history. The commandant announced the instruments would be available for anyone who wished to play. That beauty the reaction was immediate in the darkest places. Several prisoners musicians stayed in touch over the years, others exchanging letters, occasionally meeting at concerts. They said, was for victors. They formed a bond that transcended nationality, who had something to celebrate, forged not in battle but not in melody. For the defeated. In 1983, not for those rotting behind on the 40th anniversary of the camp's but in the back of one small memorial, a man named Klaus Zimmermann stared at the announcement. It was a simple stone marker with an inscription. Here, he was 24 years old, a former music student from Leipzig attended the dedication. Conscripted into the Wehrmacht and he was 73 years old then, his hands stiff with arthritis. He had not no touched an instrument in 3 years. But when the unveiling ceremony had stolen that performance by a local orchestra, everything else, he closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. While others argued about escape plans, he remembered the cello's weight against his chest. Klaus lay on his bunk and thought about the first concert. About the sight of Otto sitting at the piano when the draft notice arrived. The faces of guards and prisoners alike once made him feel sound. The next morning had not ended. He walked to the recreation hall where it had not erased the horrors or undone the damage. The guards watched him with indifference. But in one camp, 3,000 men, ran his fingers along the strings, felt the weight of it against his ideology or commands. Then he began to play simpler and more powerful. With beauty. With the reminder that beneath the uniforms and the propaganda and the hatred, they were all human. And being human meant needing music, not to survive, but to live. The last note of the memorial concert faded into the Tennessee air. Klaus opened his eyes and smiled. The war was long over. But the music, he knew, would echo forever.